Alright then, lads, ladies, and those of us who know better. My name is Jackson MTT Kenny, and welcome back to Bold and Bright. I've mentioned on here previously that I'm a big horror fan, and when I say horror fan, I'd like to limit that down a bit because I'm not a fan of, say, slasher horror or anything especially gory. I've got a distaste for the stuff that really feels like it's trying to shock you, or like jump scare horror, and also, I cannot remember the word for it, analog. I'm sorry, I don't like Five Nights at Freddy's. It feels like an awful lot of waiting around doing absolutely nothing, and I need a story to go off. Like, spooky stories have genuinely kept me up at night a lot more than I'd care to admit, but staring at a wall for a while waiting for a teddy bear to jump at you, I'm sorry, I've got better ways to spend 12 hours. That sounded very salty. Enjoy what you like. I know a lot of people have a special interest in it, but I just can't. The style of horror that I like is specifically story-based. I like to know, like, vaguely what's going on, who's involved, and, there's a clear beginning, middle, and end. So if we're going to talk about, say, my favorite horror media, hands down, it's like Magnus Archives and Coraline. Now, I think I've talked about both of these before because I covered them a little bit for Inktober, but brief overview, I had the movie Coraline on DVD and I watched it a lot when I was like sitting in a caravan, and my primary school also put it on once for a thing, which my auntie was actually my class assistant, and she had to leave the room. She made up an excuse about needing to visit the printer so she didn't have to watch Coraline. That poor woman spent literal hours just walking paper back and forth through a school building so she wouldn't get spooked by it. I loved it. I watched all the theories about it I could find. The soundtrack is so spooky, and then a couple years later for a Halloween thing, I wound up reading the book. Really, really good. There's a video by Lavender Town where she talks a bit more about the Coraline book and also the differences in character designs between the book and the film. In the movie thing, the other father turns into a pumpkin dude, and in the book, actually, you know what? I'll let you either read it yourself or watch the Lavender Town video because that might have just been one of the freakiest parts of it. That and the singing rats and whatever the flip was living in the tunnel. So how I got into the Magnus Archives was, okay, I operate in like a lot of online queer spaces, so obviously it had come up. But I was on like a book club thing and someone said, oh my god, I'm listening to the Magnus Archives, it's really good. And I said like, oh, it's on Spotify. And I went, oh, I have Spotify, I guess I'll listen till it. I listened till it at like 11 or 12 o'clock at night. So the first episode of the Magnus Archives is called The Anglerfish, or maybe just Anglerfish, and it is so spooky. They got off to a great start, and the premise of the Magnus Archives, because I think it's a little bit less in the pop culture domain than, say, Coraline would be, but there's this wee dude, Jonathan Sims, and he started working in archives, researching the supernatural, but he has no idea what he's doing, and he's super sarcastic all the time, and won't spoil what happens, but, he softens just a little bit in the face of unimaginable horrors. True story about me listening to the first episode of the Magnus Archives. I was, again, listening to it at really late at night, pitch black, and I got so spooked by that bloody, like, whack Scottish fish that I started panicking and checked to make sure all the doors and windows were locked. Turns out the front door wasn't locked, so I had to go and try and lock it, but at the time, our front door was broken, so you had to, like, physically pull it all the way back and then slam it really hard with, like, the handle down to get it to work, and then move the handle up. It was such a convoluted broken door. It isn't enough that you could just kick it. It had to have a whole very, very noisy system, and what that noisy system meant was that I woke up everyone in the house at like 11 o'clock at night, just frantically trying to slam a door quietly, repeatedly, and very badly. So in the end, my dad came down and shut the door for me. Thanks, Dad. And I was too embarrassed to admit that I was so scared of the big Scottish fish that I had. Okay, another point about me. I hate fish. I've had nightmares about those things since I was no, okay, I cannot do fish at all. I know my dad tried to bring me on fishing trips. I was just sitting in the back with a book. I'm sorry. Chilling beside a lake? Great. Weird gapy mouths and eyes and their weird spiky bodies. I don't like it. Now, when I was a bit younger, I listened to, like, Snarled, and specifically there, you know the thing where it opened on the wee animation of your woman going, do you want to hear something scary? I watched nearly all of those, and then got too scared to sleep, because baby me wasn't that smart. And in terms of just supernatural horror, I'll probably have to make like a proper tier rank of this or whatever in the future. But I'm not sure. But in the thing of werewolves versus vampires, definitely werewolves. Like, I blame that on someone letting baby me watch all those bloody Alvin and the Chipmunk monster movies, which the songs of those have lived rent-free in my head for, like nearly 2 decades now. No, it's like hymns, like keep popping into my head at inopportune moments, but I remember the Wolfman one, I really liked it. We also had like the Frankenstein one on DVD, so horror monsters, ooh, love those. And looping back to Coraline, the Beldam / the Other Mother, holy frick, that's a good horror character. That is a kid's book! A kid's book that really, really doesn't feel like a kid's book at times, but, well, I loved it. And something that I've had a bit of difficulty trying to explain is that I love horror in hindsight. So, look, I love slow creeping dread. I love when there's like an itty bitty little trail of clues pointing you to it in a certain direction. So, spoilers for the Magnus Archives, like season 2 or whatever, but the dude has a couple of assistants. One of them is named Sasha. At the end of season 1, she gets murdered by a creepy thing and then gets replaced by a shapeshifter. And there are clues in like the whole 2 seasons leading up to that reveal that the shapeshifter, that she'd been replaced by like a shapeshifter, or that there was a precedent for shapeshifters being in this world. And let me tell you, like, I think I like fully shivered and had to like stare at a wall for a minute when it finally clicked in my head that like, oh, that's not Sasha. Like, shapeshifting in general to me is so cool. I think that might just be my inner transness coming out. So, shapeshifting in horror, 10 out of 10. Love it. But a lot of the horror from that came from the fact that it had been set up. If it had just, like, carried on as normal, and then one day she jumped out from behind a door looking all spooky and going, ooh, I've secretly been a thing this whole time. Sorry, I would have been so much more bored, because, sure, you've got one good jump scare instead of 2 seasons of build-up with, here's the precedent for shapeshifters, here's the thing for people being stolen by furniture. I have gone down so many conspiracy board rabbit holes over this. A very good friend of mine is also into the Magnus Archives, like really into the Magnus Archives, hyperfixated on it at the same time. It holds my record for longest info dump session ever, and that is saying something. If you're curious, it was from 10:30 at night to 2:30 in the morning, just talking about the Magnus Archives. And we hadn't even finished it yet. Never underestimate the power of autism and ADHD in getting people to talk about things for hours. Because I will. And just in terms of general horror aesthetics, in general, I'm not much of a city person, and my entire family's working class, so the whole, like, oh, big spooky castle, or creepy city basement or whatever, that doesn't appeal to me quite as much, just because I don't have the precedent for it. Back when my family still had a caravan, there was a ruin of a church at the bottom of the road that we visited all the time. And to date, one of my spookiest memories is walking down to the thing when it was super duper foggy and all the animals were freaking out. And one time we found a salt circle in there. Yeah, fun fact about that little church ruin, the only part of it still completely standing was the morgue. And see, I got like a little hit of the horror serotonin there. It's like, oh, the only part of it still standing is the morgue? Tell me more. I feel like I've gone off on so many tangents over the course of this, but it really is just because I love horror that much. And frankly, I would consider myself to be extremely wimpy. I get anxiety very easily. There was an episode of the Magnus Archives that I had to skip, but that was less because I was scared and more because it was focusing on like body image related horror, and I've got an eating disorder and dysphoria, so that I just wasn't in the mood to listen to it that day. And that's fine. Really, a lot of horror is derived from psychology and what naturally spooks people, and there's a very fine line between cathartic and just plain kind of grim. It's become something of a stereotype. Then like slasher films or whatever, you get, oh, the hot naked lady and then she gets murdered, dun dun dun. And really, I don't like that at all. It just feels so contrived that you put a naked lady there just to see her get murdered. Frankly, that feels like I should be more concerned on the part of the director than anything else. But when people take their own trauma and their own personality, and they put it into something like horror where you don't have to dial it back so much. You can go wild. Like some of the stuff with the Magnus Archives, if you know, you know. Ugh, bone apple teeth, ew. Ooh, dipping into the tragic backstory here, it was another one of the episodes of Magnus Archives Season 5 episode called Wonderland. I think it was called Wonderland. Anyway, I won't spoil too much of what happened in that episode, but what happened in that episode was actually what happened to me. And I kept waiting for something else to happen. I was waiting for, like, a demon to come out of the floor, or for there to be meat everywhere. God damn it, Johnny, what was with you and the meat? Ugh. But it just didn't. Frankly, the only spooky thing was that, like, oh, the nurses don't really have faces, and that was about it. And it felt so validating just hearing what had happened to me being presented as horror. Like, no, this is bad, this is traumatic, this is horrifying. And yeah, it really, really was. 0 out of 10, would not recommend going through that nonsense. So, in conclusion, I don't really have one other than, this is a big recommendation for the things I mentioned. Go listen to the Magnus Archives. The Magnus Protocol is coming out later this month. Yep, that brings us quite nicely to the outro. I've got an art blog on Tumblr. You can find me, at Blue Bold and Bright or Jackson MTT Kenny. Like and subscribe this if you want more of it. Oh, I felt like such a professional YouTuber there. Videos come out every other Friday, and, yep, thank you for watching. My name is Jackson MTT Kenny, and this has been Bold and Bright.